This is a story about knots. It's about how people learned to tie them and why they are so useful. It's gonna take us back to the dawn of humanity. And it starts with this guy right here. So these guys were using vines. They were using sinew. They were using plant fibers. They were making shelters out of branches that were lashed together with those vines. They were making tools. They were building spears. They were doing all kinds of stuff with these materials that we would today consider to be kind of primitive cordage. And then something amazing happened about 12,000 years later. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa. We started off pretty much like all the other hominids before us, living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, barely surviving from day to day. But we had one advantage. We had language. We had language, and that gave us the ability to communicate ideas, plans, stories, history. We had the ability to record events, to keep track of who had done what, to whom, and when. And we had the ability to plan ahead. And this made an enormous difference, because now we weren't just trying to survive day by day. We were actually able to think about the future and how to secure it. But even though we had this tremendous cognitive leap, we still didn't have agriculture. We still didn't have domesticated animals. We were still relying on the wild for both food and clothing. And that meant we still had to rely on gathering plants, berries, fruit, roots, nuts, seeds. And we still had to hunt animals. And with 2 hands, you can only carry so much. So we needed some way to take what we had gathered, or what we had hunted, and carry more of it back to the camp. Enter the backpack. Now, backpacks seem very simple, but they were a huge step forward for humanity. And again, we could have used a simple sack made out of animal hide, maybe secured with a simple toggle or a toggle and a lashing of some sort. But imagine how heavy that would be on your shoulders. You need some way to distribute that weight across your back. So instead, what we did is we took vines, we took plant fibers, we took strips of hide, and we wove them together into a mesh sack that fit over our shoulders. Now we could carry twice as much or 3 times as much, which meant we could gather 3 times as many plants or hunt animals that were bigger and stronger. And with all of these materials that we were carrying, whether it was plants or hides or meat or whatever, we needed a way to keep everything in place. So we started tying things down, not with adhesive, not with glue, but with knots. We tied up bundles of plants so they wouldn't come apart in our backpacks. We tied game so we could carry it more easily back to the camp. We tied things up so that they wouldn't blow away in the wind or float away in a river. But then we also started to use those knots for other things. Maybe you've seen those old adventure movies where they're trying to get out of a cave that has a big boulder jammed in the entrance. Someone ties a rope around the boulder, makes a pulley system, and then they start heaving on the rope to get the boulder out. Well, there's no reason to think that we couldn't have done something like that. If we could tie a rope around a rock, then we could also use that rope to move rocks. And the same thing with logs. If we could use ropes to move boulders, then we could also use those same ropes to move logs. And that meant that we could build shelters. We could build fences. We could build pens for our animals. We could build boats. We could use these techniques to go out and harvest plants that were further and further away from the camp. We could bring back larger quantities of plants and animals. We could start to store food. And as we started storing food, it meant that we didn't always have to go out and gather every single day, which meant that we had time to sit around and do other things. And one of the things we started doing was making pottery. And the way that we made pottery, we probably discovered, was by taking a large piece of clay, tying it up with a rope, so that we could hang it over a fire and slowly dry it out. We put that dried out clay. We put it in our primitive oven. We baked it, and then we got this hard, durable material that we could use to cook with, that we could store food in. And if you look around the neck of a ceramic pot or a ceramic jar, sometimes you'll see some indentations that are left over from that rope that was used to hang it up. This goes back thousands of years. Archaeologists have found pieces of prehistoric pottery that have indentations in the necks from the cordage that was used to suspend them from a fire. And this isn't unique to pottery either. If you look at a wooden bucket, you can see those same impressions around the staves of the bucket from the rope that was used to hold the bucket together. While it was being formed, anything that you can make with a rope or a vine or a cordage of some kind, you can make without knots. But you're going to have to use much stronger materials. You're going to have to use thicker vines or larger trees, and you're going to have to use significantly more of them. This will take you significantly longer. Your shelters are going to leak. Your containers are going to break. Your boats are going to fall apart. All of these things are going to fail much more often than if you had used knots. Because knots add strength, they concentrate that strength in a small area. They help you control loads, reduce wear and tear on your cords or on your ropes. They allow you to join materials together that otherwise you couldn't join. You could build structures that you otherwise never could have built. And the best part is you only need 2 hands. Okay, let's think about this. What is a knot? Well, a knot is a manipulation of a flexible loop, or loops through itself, or through another flexible structure. And when you do this, you form a new structure that has properties that are different than the original structure. So if you take a length of rope, let's say it's 10 feet long, maybe it's an inch in diameter. It's going to have certain properties. It's going to be bendable. It's going to be flexible. It's going to be extensible to a certain degree. It's going to snap back. It's going to have a lot of different properties. And if you take a loop of that same rope, well, it's going to have different properties. It's going to be less flexible, but it's going to be less extensible. It's going to be stronger in a lot of ways. It's going to be weaker in a lot of other ways. And by tying a knot, you're taking this flexible loop and you're manipulating it through itself or through some other structure. You're forming a third structure that has different properties yet again. You're turning this into something that is stronger, more durable, more controllable. So really, a knot is this combination of geometry, material science, and mechanics. A lot of times, people ask me, well, what's the oldest knot that was ever used? And this is really hard to answer, because most of the time, when archaeologists find a piece of rope or a piece of cordage, the knots aren't there anymore. Knots tend to be weaker than the rope itself, so they fail first. So most of the time, when we're looking at ancient artifacts, we don't have any knots left to examine. That said, there are a few cases where we do. For example, this box was found in a cave in France. It's believed to be about 15,000 years old. It was found alongside some other artifacts, some stone tools, some deer bones that had been worked into arrowheads. It was found alongside some animal bones that had been carefully cut and shaped into projectile points. Things that had been done with a very high level of skill and intention. These projectile points were razor sharp. They were incredibly durable. They were designed to hunt the largest animals that were available in Europe at that time: woolly mammoths and reindeer. But the box is remarkable. It's made out of oak, and the ends of the oak planks have been charred black. They've been waterproofed with a resin called pine resin, and the planks themselves have been held together with willow twigs, and those have been lashed together with a plant fiber cordage. What's remarkable about this box is the lid. The lid has two hinges. They're made out of bone, and they're fastened together with a series of knots. If you look at those knots, you can see that they're not just simple overhand knots. They're complex knots. There's something called a Turk's head knot. It's been tied in such a way as to concentrate its strength at a small point. So this little bitty knot is holding the entire lid of this box in place. We don't know what was inside the box, but we do know that whoever made this box was resourceful enough to use every tool available to them to solve the problems that they faced. And that's the story of knots. Every culture, everywhere on Earth, from the very beginning of recorded history until today, knots have been used to solve problems, to improve our lives, to help us adapt to the world around us. And that's why we tell the story of knots. The ancient Egyptians were masters of using knots in various applications, including in their sails, fishing nets, and rope bridges. They also used knots to create decorative patterns and symbols, and they even used them in religious rituals. In fact, there is evidence that the Egyptians kept records of their knotted patterns, suggesting that they had a deep understanding of their symbolic meaning and practical applications. One of the most well-known examples of Egyptian knots is the so-called Solomon's knot, which was found in the tomb of King Tutankhamun. This knot is actually an 8-pointed star, and it is believed to have been used as a symbol of the sun god Ra, who was one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon. It is also possible that the Egyptians used this not in their astronomical observations, since it can be used to divide the sky into 8 sections or octans. The octans could then be used to track the movements of the stars and planets, and by knowing their exact location in the sky at any given time, the Egyptians could predict eclipses and other astronomical events. Egyptians also used complex knots in the construction of their boats and ships, which were essential for their seafaring activities in the Mediterranean Sea and along the Nile River. These knots allowed them to create strong and durable structures that could withstand the forces of wind and water. For example, Egyptians used a type of square knot known as the reef knot to join ropes together. This knot is still used today for tying packages and other objects, and is one of the most basic and fundamental knots in seafaring. Egyptians also used a type of triangular knot known as the Turk's head knot to create strong loops in the rigging of their ships. This knot is still used today in various applications, such as securing guy wires and in the construction of hammocks. The Egyptians were also known for their skill in creating fishing nets, and they used various types of knots to secure the nets and ensure that they held up over time. These nets were not only used for catching fish, but also for catching birds and small animals. Egyptians used a type of overhand knot known as the shipshank to attach fishing lines to their hooks. This knot is still used today for joining 2 ropes of different diameters, and is a relatively simple knot to learn. Overall, the Egyptians left behind a rich legacy of knowledge and skills related to the use of knots in various applications. Their mastery of nautical science and seafaring activities enabled them to explore and trade along the coastlines and rivers of their vast empire. Now, let's take a trip east to China and explore the fascinating role that knots played in ancient Chinese culture. You may be surprised to learn that the Chinese kept detailed records of their knotted patterns, indicating that they had a deep understanding of their symbolic meaning and practical applications. What's more, archaeologists have discovered that the Chinese were using knots as early as the Neolithic period, with some examples dating back to 7000 BC. During the Shang dynasty, which lasted from 1600 to 1046 BC. The Chinese began using more elaborate knots to decorate ceremonial garments and accessories. The most famous example is the ritual knotted gown, which was worn by high-ranking officials during important ceremonies. Each knot had a specific meaning, and the patterns on the gown would have been carefully chosen to convey a particular message. During the spring and autumn period, which lasted from 770 to 446 BC, the Chinese began using knots in astronomy. They would tie a series of knots on a rope and then use the resulting pattern to predict astronomical events, such as eclipses and the movement of the planets. During the Warring States period, which lasted from 475 to 221 BC, the Chinese began using knots to record numbers and keep track of time. They would tie a knot for each day of the month, and then count the number of knots to determine the date. In addition to their practical and symbolic uses, knots also played a significant role in Chinese art and literature. Many famous Chinese poems and paintings feature knots and their beauty and complexity. The Chinese were particularly fond of a type of knot known as the Chinese button knot, which can be used to create intricate designs on fabric and other materials. Today, the tradition of making knotted decorations continues in China and around the world. People of all ages enjoy learning how to make different types of knots and then using them to create unique pieces of art. Whether it be for a necklace, a bracelet, or a piece of clothing, the possibilities are endless. So, if you're looking for a fun and creative activity, why not try your hand at making a knotted decoration? You never know what kind of masterpiece you might create. Our next stop takes us to Greece and Rome, where the use of knots was widespread and varied. The Greeks and Romans used knots in medicine, seafaring, and rituals, among many other things. In fact, there is archaeological evidence that suggests that the ancient Greeks were using surgical sutures as early as 800 BC. These sutures were made from animal gut or plant fiber and were tied off with a special knot called the surgeon's knot. This knot is still used today in surgery to secure sutures in place and is one of the most important knots for medical professionals to know. Moreover, the Greeks and Romans were skilled sailors and traders, and they used knots to secure their ships and cargo. They also used knots in navigation to help them keep track of their course and location. For example, the ancient Greeks used a type of knotted rope called a knotted line to measure distances both on land and at sea. This rope would have been marked with knots at regular intervals and would have been used to measure distances such as the length of a ship or the width of a piece of land. Additionally, the Greeks and Romans used knots in construction, whether it be building ships, houses, or other structures. They needed to know how to use knots to secure materials and create strong, stable structures. The Romans in particular were known for their engineering skills, and they used knots in many of their construction projects, including the building of roads and aqueducts. Finally, the Greeks and Romans also used knots in art and decoration. They would often incorporate knots into jewelry, clothing, and other decorative items. The Greeks, in particular, were fond of a type of knot known as the Greek key pattern, which is a repeating pattern of knots and crosses. This pattern is still used today in many different contexts and is one of the most recognizable patterns in world history. But why should we care about knots? Why not just use duct tape? Well, duct tape was invented in 1942, and back then, sailors were already miles out at sea. Some knots are so simple, even a landlubber like me can tie them. The reef not being one of them. It's also known as the square knot. It's incredibly versatile and very easy to untie. That is, if you're not colorblind. So how do you tie a reef knot? Well, overhand knot, pass the end under the top loop and pull it tight. Then take the other end and go under the second loop and pull it tight. Ta-da! You've successfully tied a reef knot. But be careful though, because it can come undone if tied incorrectly. There's nothing worse than finding yourself adrift at sea with a broken boat because you tied your fishing net in the wrong order. Happens to the best of us. Now, when I first learned about the clove hitch, I was convinced it was a trick. Like, no way can you really tie a boat to something with just 2 loops. Well, believe it or not, this seemingly magical knot is strong enough to secure ships in place, making it a vital tool for sailors. It's also known as the sailor's knot or the 2 half hitches. This is how you do it. Pass the rope around the pole, form a loop, bring the end up and over the standing part of the rope, then tuck it under the first loop. Easy peasy. Repeat the process for the second loop and tighten it up. Now, with a little practice, you'll be able to tie your boat up like a pro. Just to make sure you always double-check your knots before setting sail, because you never know when you might need them. When it comes to sailing ships, the bowline is one of the most important knots to know. Also known as the king's knot or the trusty knot, this handy tool is used for securing cargo and mooring ships. What makes the bowline unique is that it forms a fixed loop that won't change size, which is super handy when you need to attach a rope to something securely. Plus, unlike many other knots, it won't come undone on its own. Once it's tied, it's tied. To make a bowline, start by forming a loop in the rope. Next, pass the end of the rope through the loop and up over the standing part. Then, pass the end of the rope back down through the loop and pull it tight. Voila! You've got yourself a trusty bowline knot that won't let you down. But the fun doesn't stop there. Sailors have used these 3 simple knots to conquer the seas for centuries. And along the way, they've developed some pretty wild superstitions about them. First, let's talk about the long and storied history of the bowline. Legend has it that this knot was named after the ship's bowsprit, which is the long pole that extends from the front of the ship. Back in the day, sailors would use the bowline to attach the anchor chain to the ship, so it wouldn't drag in the water. One sailor's tale goes that a ship once broke free from its moorings during a storm because someone forgot to tie a proper bowline knot. Talk about a close call. Another legend claims that King George II was so impressed with the strength and versatility of the bowline knot that he declared it the King's Knot in honor of his favorite game of bowls. Legend has it that while playing a particularly intense game, the king's ball rolled dangerously close to a nearby river, but it was saved from certain doom by a sturdy bowline knot that happened to be tied around the bank. But our favorite sailor's superstition has to do with the clove hitch. According to legend, this knot was invented by a sailor named Clovius, who was known for his love of cloves. One day, while sailing the high seas, Clovius realized that he was running low on his precious cloves, so he decided to tie a special knot to help him remember where he'd hidden his stash. And voila, the clove hitch was born. Of course, that's just a fun little story, but it's a great reminder to always keep your wits about you on the open seas. Why? Never know when you might need to use a little creativity to remember where you've stashed your most prized possessions. Maybe not your prized possessions, but definitely don't forget where you put your life buoys. As for the reef knot, well, it's been around for so long that nobody knows for sure who invented it. Some say it was a humble fisherman who needed a quick and easy way to tie his nets. Others claim it was a legendary sailor who learned the trick while exploring uncharted waters. Whatever its origins, the reef knot has stood the test of time and continues to be one of the most popular and practical knots for sailors today. Of course, every good sailor knows that tying knots isn't just about practicality, it's also about tradition. After all, it's not every day that you get to say you're following in the footsteps of legendary explorers and adventurers. Plus, there's just something satisfying about knowing that you've mastered a skill that's been passed down for generations. Who knows? Maybe one day, your own knots will become legendary and your name will be whispered in awe by sailors for centuries to come. But now, we want to hear from you. Do you have any fun facts about sailors and their knots to share with us? Maybe you've heard some spooky ghost stories about lost ships, or maybe you've seen some amazing feats of knot tying in real life. Either way, we can't wait to hear your stories. So drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. And while you're at it, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more epic adventures. We've got all kinds of exciting content coming up that you won't want to miss out on. So join our crew and get ready for an adventure of a lifetime. The old salts used to spin yarns about how the reef knot could magically tighten when you wanted it to, which made it perfect for tying up loose cannon mates who got a little too rowdy after a night of grog. They'd say if you tied the reef knot correctly, it would tighten its grip until the pipsqueak calmed down. Of course, that was just a tall tale meant to scare young sailors straight. But it shows you how much thought and creativity went into every aspect of seafaring life. And let's not forget about the countless variations of these basic knots that sailors came up with over the years. Take the 2 half hitches, for example. It's basically a clove hitch that's been doubled up for extra security. Or the rolling hitch, which is perfect for tying down barrels or other round objects. And who could forget the slippery noose, which was supposedly used by pirates to hang their victims without leaving any marks on their necks. Okay, maybe we won't dwell on that one too much. The point is, there's a whole world of nautical know-how out there that's waiting to be discovered. So, if you're a landlubber looking to add a little adventure to your life, why not learn a few sailor's knots? This is a form of Celtic braid knotwork that doesn't have a beginning or an end. It is a continuous loop that goes on forever. It is important to understand that back then they didn't have a compass, so they would make these knots by hand. So it wasn't easy to make these perfect loops. So the ones that they made were actually more of a spiral shape than a loop. But even with that, it took a lot of concentration and practice to be able to make these knots. They also used another kind of knot called the trichrea. This is the one that has 3 arms, and if you look closely, there isn't any start or end point. It is a continuous curve. They would use this symbol to represent the Trinity: God, the Father, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Another example is the endless knot. This one is similar to the first one that we saw, but instead of being just a spiral shape, it is a square shape. This one represents 4 things like the 4 Gospels. These symbols could be used in different ways. For example, they could be carved into a stone cross or be painted on the side of a church. They could even be used on jewelry, like rings or pendants. They were important because they showed that the person who wore them believed in the Christian faith. It was a way to show your faith without saying anything. The book says that some people think that the triquetra shows the 3 parts of Ireland: the north, south, and east. But the endless knot shows the 4 provinces of Ireland, the 4 evangelists, the 4 elements, and the 4 seasons. The next part of the chapter talks about knots and marriage. Some cultures have the tradition of tying the knot, which means that the couple is joined together like 2 ends of a rope. When people get married, they often exchange rings. Rings are circular and they don't have any ends. So they show that the love between the couple is endless. There is another tradition in which the bride and groom each hold one end of a long ribbon or cord, and when they get married, they tie a knot to join the two ends together. This knot is a symbol of their love and commitment to each other. They stay together through thick and thin. This is just like how sailors used to tie square knots to keep their ropes secure. The book says that this tradition of tying the knot can be found in many different cultures all around the world. For example, the ancient Greeks and Romans did this too. They saw the knot as a symbol of the union between two people. Next, let's talk about how knots are used for protection against evil and disease. People in Scotland used to wear a special type of bracelet made from a strip of cloth. They called it a grips. This bracelet had a magic knot tied on it that was supposed to protect them from evil spirits. They believed that these evil spirits could cause illness or harm. So the grips served as a way to keep them away. You can see that this is very similar to how sailors used protective knots before dangerous journeys. These knots acted as a shield against storms and bad luck, just like the grips worn by the Scots. To activate these protective knots, you had to say a prayer while tying them. The most common one was the Lord's Prayer, but sometimes you could use any prayer that felt right. This practice was popular during the 18th century, especially among the poor and uneducated. They believed that these knots were blessed by God and had power over evil spirits. This is an example of how people used knots to fight against evil. In medieval Germany, there was a belief that demons could enter a person's body through their pores. To prevent this, people would tie a knot around their waist. This practice was mostly followed by women. They would wear linen cloths around their waist with a knot on top. This acted as a barrier between their bodies and the outside world. It was like a shield against demons. The knot was considered a strong symbol of protection because it was placed in a strategic location close to the center of the body. It was also believed that the knot could help balance the body's natural energies and promote overall health and well-being. This is an example of how people used knots for protection. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's wife would tie a special knot to protect herself from evil spirits. This knot was called the master's knot. It was a complex overhand knot that had magical powers according to the beliefs of the time. The wife would wrap the knot around her waist and believe that it would keep her safe from harm. Each time she walked out in public, this practice was seen as a way to maintain harmony within the royal family. It was also connected to religious beliefs and the desire to have a healthy and happy pregnancy. The master's knot was more than just a simple piece of cloth. It represented the woman's status and importance. The act of tying the knot itself was seen as a ritual that could bring good luck and blessings. Another example is the Chinese symbol for immortality. This is a special knot that was used in old Chinese culture. It was mainly used by men who wanted to live longer and avoid death. This knot represented the idea of immortality, like never dying. It was made from two long pieces of paper that were twisted together. This knot became a symbol of good luck and health in Chinese culture. People believed that it could bring them good fortune and help them live longer. In Japan, there is a custom where boys receive a special string bracelet on their 7th birthday. This bracelet is called a masawita. It is a small rectangular piece of paper that is folded and put inside a string bracelet. The bracelet is worn on the left wrist, and it acts as a charm to protect the boy from evil spirits. The masuda is particularly important in Japanese culture because it is given to the boy by his family to mark his coming of age. It is a symbol of their love and protection for their son as he enters a new phase in his life. The act of putting on the bracelet is considered a ritual that strengthens the bond between the boy and his family. It is a reminder for him to stay humble, honest, and respectful as he grows up. For vertical rescue operations, such as climbing, as I mentioned before, the bowline is a really strong knot that won't slip, and those qualities make it ideal for climbing. If you go rock climbing or ice climbing with ropes, then chances are you use a bowline on the end of your ropes. This is especially true if you do top rope climbing. On top rope climbing, one person is above the anchor and one person is below the anchor. And in that situation, the climber above the anchor will have a bowline on a sling around a piece of protection, like a bolt or a nut. That way, if the climber above the anchor falls, the rope will be secured and won't slip out of the protection. And just like the other applications, the bowline is really easy to untie once you're done, which is why it's the perfect knot for climbing. But one of the most interesting stories about a knot comes from Greek mythology with the legend of the Gordian knot. The story goes that King Minos of Crete dedicated a wagon to his son, but two thieves came along and stole it. The oracle then told him to go find his wagon near the city of Gordium, and there he found a wagon hitched to an altar with an ox across the yoke, and the axle was fastened together with an intricate knot. Minois was unable to untie the knot, so he cut it with his sword, and that angered the gods, who said that whoever untied the knot would become ruler of Asia. Then along came a young man named Alexander the Great, who didn't know about the prophecy. He looked at the knot and thought to himself, "Who cares if I become emperor? I'm gonna undo this thing." And he did. But instead of cutting it, he simply pulled on one of the ends, and the whole thing came undone. When the gods saw that the knot was untied, not cut, they knew that Alexander the Great was the one who was destined to rule Asia. And that is the legend of Alexander the Great and the Gordian knot. Now, the story of Alexander the Great and the Gordian knot is probably apocryphal, but it illustrates an important point about knots. Oftentimes, the best solution isn't to keep trying the same method that isn't working, but to look at the problem from a different angle. Sometimes, you need to think outside the box and be creative in your problem solving. Just like Alexander the Great, sometimes the best solution is the simplest one. Speaking of thinking outside the box, if you need help with your work or school projects, whether it's writing an essay or building a spreadsheet, so let's continue on with the video. The square knot is a super simple knot that most people learn as kids. But did you know that this simple knot has saved countless lives during mountaineering and exploration? For example, Sir Edmund Hillary used a square knot when he scaled Mount Everest in 1953, and Thor Heyerdahl used a square knot when he crossed the Pacific Ocean on a balsa wood raft in 1947. And that's because the square knot is really good for joining two ropes together. And both of these adventurers needed to join ropes together during their expeditions. If you want to tie a square knot, start by holding the two ropes in each hand. Then cross the right rope over the left rope and tuck it underneath. Then do the same thing on the other side, crossing the left rope over the right rope and tucking it underneath. And you've got yourself a square knot. Now this is one of the simplest knots that you can tie, but it's also one of the most dangerous because if you tie it incorrectly, it can easily come undone. So make sure that you practice this knot and make sure that you know how to tie it properly. That way, you don't find yourself in a situation like what happened to Joe Simpson in the book and movie Touching the Void. Speaking of mountaineering, another simple yet effective knot used by mountaineers is the clove hitch. This knot is really good for securing a rope to an object like a carabiner or a rock. And mountaineers often use it to rappel down a rock face. To tie a clove hitch, start by making a loop, then pass the rope through the loop and around the object. Then bring the rope back up and through the loop again. Tighten it all down and you've got yourself a clove hitch. This is another knot that's really easy to untie, which is important if you're rappelling down a rock face because you might need to stop and make adjustments along the way. Speaking of rappelling, another really useful knot for mountaineers is the figure 8 follow-through. This knot is also used to rappel, but it's used in situations where the rope needs to go around an object like a tree or a rock. And it's really good for deep water soloing or DWS, which is basically where you rappel down a rock face and you have very little rope between you and the water. To tie a figure 8 follow-through, start by making a loop and passing the rope through the loop. Then pass the rope around the object and back through the loop. Repeat the process and tighten it all down, and you've got yourself a figure 8 follow-through. As you can see, there are lots of different knots that can be used for war and exploration. Each knot has its own unique uses and benefits, so be sure to learn as many as you can so you're prepared for any situation. Knots are all around us. We use them every day without even realizing it. From shoelaces to furniture to even our clothes. It's hard to imagine how we would live without knots. But did you know that knots are also used in more complex situations, such as in mathematics, physics, DNA research, and molecular biology? And if you like science, there's a good chance that you've encountered some of these topics at least once. When you think about it, a knot is just a continuous loop with some crossings. In other words, it's a mathematical object. There are actually two ways mathematicians study knots. The first way is through knot theory, which focuses on the properties of knots. For example, mathematicians might try to figure out if a particular knot can be untied, or if it's impossible. They also study the different types of knots and try to classify them based on their properties. In fact, there's an entire branch of mathematics devoted to the study of knots. The second way mathematicians study knots is by using them as models for other mathematical problems. This approach has led to some surprising connections between the seemingly disparate fields of knot theory and other areas of mathematics, such as algebraic topology, geometric measurements, and even quantum field theory. Who knew that knots could be so useful in mathematics? But wait a minute, aren't knots supposed to be useful in real life? Well, actually, they are. Let's take a look at another area where knots come in handy: physics. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Standard Model of particle physics. This model describes the fundamental particles and forces of nature, and it's one of the most important concepts in the field. Now here's where the knots come in. Physicists have recently discovered that the Standard Model of particle physics can be represented by a network of knots. Each particle is represented by a different type of knot, and the connections between the knots represent the forces that act on those particles. This discovery has helped physicists to better understand the nature of the universe, and it's also led to some new insights into the behavior of subatomic particles. And while we're talking about physics, let's take a look at another area where knots come in handy: DNA research and molecular biology. You see, DNA molecules are like long, thin strings that carry genetic information. And just like any string, they can get tangled up in each other. Now, this is a big problem, because if the DNA molecules are too tangled up, they can't function properly. This can lead to all sorts of genetic disorders and diseases. So what do molecular biologists do to prevent this? They use knots. By understanding how knots work, they can develop techniques to untangle DNA molecules. This is not only helped them to better understand the genetic material, but it's also led to new treatments for genetic disorders and diseases. All right, now let's talk about another area where knots are used: surgery. Surgeons use knots to tie off blood vessels and other tissues during operations. The surgeon will first make an incision and then use a needle and thread to close the wound. The surgeon needs to make sure that the knot is secure so that it doesn't come undone during surgery. If the knot comes undone, it could cause bleeding or other complications. There are many different types of knots that surgeons can use, but they typically use the square knot. The square knot is a simple and secure knot that is easy to tie. Surgeons practice tying knots before they perform surgery so that they can make sure that they can tie a secure knot quickly and efficiently. But knots aren't just used in the operating room. They're also used in many other areas of medicine. For example, knots are used in orthopedics to secure bandages and casts. They're also used in dentistry to hold dental floss in place between teeth. Even in the field of plastic surgery, knots are used to secure sutures in place. So whether you're having surgery, a cast put on your broken bone, or even getting a filling at the dentist, there's a good chance that knots will play a role in your treatment. Okay, now let's move on to another area where knots come in handy: climbing. Whether you're scaling the side of a building or hiking in the mountains, there's always a risk that you could fall. That's why climbers use knots to secure themselves to ropes or harnesses. A knot is essentially a stopper that prevents a rope from unraveling and allows the climber to hang safely from the rope. If a climber were to fall without a knot, the rope would unravel and the climber would plummet to the ground. But with a secure knot, the rope will support the weight of the climber and prevent them from falling. There are many different types of knots that can be used for climbing, but the most common is the figure-8 knot. This knot is easy to tie and provides a secure hold on a rope. An anchor is a secure attachment point that allows the climber to rest or belay another climber. To create an anchor, a climber will drive a piece of metal or wood into the rock and then use a knot to secure the rope to the anchor. Anchors are also used to belay another climber, meaning to provide a lifeline while the other climber climbs. By securing a rope to an anchor, the belayer can catch the climber if they fall and prevent them from hitting the ground. And finally, let's talk about another area where knots come in handy: rescue operations. When someone is stuck in a high place or dangling from a rope, rescuers must use knots to secure the person to the rope and bring them down safely. A rescuer will first assess the situation and determine the best knot to use. The type of knot that is used depends on the situation. For example, if the person is dangling from a rope, a rescuer will use a different knot than if the person is stuck on a ledge. Once the rescuer has determined the best knot to use, they will secure the person to the rope and begin the rescue operation. Rescuers also use knots to create pulleys and other equipment that helps them lift heavy objects. For example, a rescuer may need to lift a person off of a mountain after they have fallen or become injured. In this situation, the rescuer will use a pulley system to lift the person to safety. The pulley system consists of a series of ropes and knots that work together to lift the person. Rescuers must be highly skilled in the use of knots and other rescue equipment. They must be able to quickly and efficiently tie knots that will hold under extreme conditions. They must also be able to use rescue equipment to lift and move heavy objects. Rescuers train extensively in the use of knots and other rescue equipment. They practice tying knots and creating pulleys and other systems that help them lift heavy objects. This training ensures that they are prepared for any situation they may encounter during a rescue operation. As you can see, there are many practical uses for knots. From helping surgeons perform complex operations to saving the lives of climbers and even aiding in the search for extraterrestrial life. Knots are a valuable tool in our everyday lives. So next time you see a knot, take a moment to appreciate its importance and all the ways that it makes our lives easier.